let's continue. We got you to the end of Uppingham. You came to Cambridge, presumably, and what did you read at Cambridge?
I came hoping to read the mathematical tripos, but my A-level results were not good enough for Trinity Hall. So I had, as it happens, taken the Cambridge Mechanical Sciences qualifying examination, which in the sixth form in Uppingham on the science side, we boys would be put into in our first year in the 2 year sixth, just as an exam which would keep us amused for that year, otherwise there would be no exams that year. And I'd taken and passed that. So when I arrived in Trinity Hall, I was down to do mechanical sciences. I wasn't really aware that mechanical sciences was just engineering. I somehow had the idea that there would be physics and so forth in it. So I went to my tutor and said, I really don't want to be an engineer. I want to be a physicist. So he said, well, that's fine. Don't go and see Dr. Smith. Go and see Dr. Bloggs instead, and we'll turn you into a physicist. That's fine. So I read part one physics and the things that go with it, like metallurgy and crystallography and so forth. I also tried to do the whole subject mathematics in the natural sciences tripos. But my maths teacher, Sean Wiley, very soon concluded that I wasn't up to doing that. So I got downgraded to doing half subject mathematics, and I had to find myself another half subject. And I chose history and philosophy of science, which is where my history and philosophy of science interests started. And one of the things that I remember is that I stopped going to the philosophy lectures because I was being taught about induction, scientific induction, but nobody was mentioning statistical inference, induction as seen from the point of view of statistics. And I had knowledge of a book called Statistical Methods for Research Workers by R.A. Fisher, which I'd been advised to look at when I spent 6 months at the Royal Greenwich Observatory in what would now be called a gap year. So I stopped going to those lectures, but I flourished nevertheless in history and philosophy of science. And then it was necessary to think of a part two. Well, this is where my aforementioned brother came in with his influence. I'd had the idea, I wanted to be a school teacher, and I'd had the idea that I'd discovered under the Cambridge regulations that I could take part one of the mathematical tripos in my third year, and I would get a degree on the basis of 2 part ones. And that, in fact, would have been a very good training for a school teacher, physics and mathematics. And John said to me, you should do a Cambridge part 2. It's a waste of Cambridge not to do a part 2. And I realised in later years that that was because he never did a part 2. He had this very distinguished scientific career, but he never had a part 2. He was a medical student, and he'd got a third in each year that he was in Cambridge, he was clearly an atypical, highly intelligent student who just didn't learn the way other people were being taught. So he left Cambridge. I think father was not too pleased, and he advised me to do a part 2. So I went to Weatherhead's in the marketplace, the then newsagents, and I bought a copy of the Reporter for the first time in my life. Not the last, I may say. And looked at the lecture list, which, to the eternal shame of the university, is no longer printed, of course. Historically, a fabulous document, the Cambridge lecture lists. I've got every copy of the Reporter back to 1870 in my college room still, my former college room. Wonderful resource. Anyway, so I started looking through and I came across part 2, through the natural science part 2 is, I came across genetics. John had sort of mentioned genetics. It was very early days for human genetics then, but I knew what genetics must be about. And I discovered that one of the lecturers was Sir Ronald Fisher. And I thought, oh, just a minute. He wrote that book I saw when I was being an astronomer, Statistical Methods for Research Workers. And I understand he's a famous statistician, but I thought he was a contemporary of Isaac Newton or something like that. I had no idea. And what's he doing teaching genetics anyway? And there was a little footnote in the Reporter which said that students contemplating reading Part 2 genetics should consult Dr. Wallace or Dr. Owen at the Department of Genetics, 44 Storey's Way, before the division of the Easter term. Okay, so I got on my bicycle. I went up, I found 44 Storey's Way, and it is the former house of the Arthur Balfour Professor, of course. Private house, large private house, provided by the benefactors of that chair. And the front door was open, and curiously enough, the next door beyond the front door was open, which was the door of a little office. And I could see somebody sitting in there who I thought must be the hall porter, because he was the sort of first human being I encountered. And this person looked at me and said, "Who are you?" So I was clutching my Reporter, and so I read the footnote, and he said, "Oh, I'm Professor Fisher, I'll do. What do you want?" So I said, well, I was wondering about the possibility of reading Part 2 genetics. Oh, he said, come out into the garden, let's talk about it. So the two of us went out into the garden, which was a beautiful place because it was full of experimental plots, as well as strawberries and other nice things in the Easter term. So we sort of chatted, and I don't remember anything of what Fisher was saying. That's terrible, because I've had no reason in the years afterwards to reinforce my memory by talking to anybody about it. All I can remember is that I had to be very careful as we walked up and down the paths, the grass paths between the experimental plots, to guess which way Fisher was going to turn when we got to the T-junction at the end. Well, after being totally fascinated by whatever it was he was saying, 2 hours passed, and he turned to me and he said, "Oh, that was very interesting." I'm not aware of having said anything, but of course he must have been quizzing me. And he said, come back tomorrow afternoon and we'll continue the conversation. Well, of course, I eagerly came back the next day. And he said, yes, I think I'm prepared to take you. You must come in the long vacation term to look at the flowers. Okay, that was my admission to Part 2 genetics. I was the only student who had applied because I'd completely bypassed the normal process of talking to your director of studies, talking to your tutor and so forth. And Fisher's Department of Genetics was regarded as a very odd place, rather suspiciously by the zoologists and the botanists, who thought that he was trespassing on their preserves, trying to do his genetics as a sort of separate activity. Anyway, so I turned up in the middle of the long vacation, and he again said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, you told me to come and look at the flowers." And he pulled from his desk an off-print, which I won't waste time by going and getting my copy of, well, my original copy of a very complicated mathematical genetics paper. And he said, when you've read that, come back and I'll give you something else. Well, it was totally incomprehensible. I mean, not only had I no biological background, so I barely knew what a gene was. I mean, I just hadn't heard of Mendel or anything. But also the mathematics that he was using to solve the problem that he was considering was far beyond my knowledge of mathematics, all to do with the theory of partitions. Okay, well, never mind, it all ended happily, and I ended up with a career in genetics.
So when you went back to see him, did you say, I didn't understand a word of what you gave me? And he said, oh, don't worry, here's another piece, or what?
No, I didn't catch that.
When you went back
Yes.
and said, I don't understand a word of what you've just given me to read, he said, it doesn't matter, why not have another piece?
No, he didn't actually say that. I don't think I ever admitted to him that I didn't really understand it. I forget the sequence of operations then, but it was the first experience of the technique that Fisher would adopt with students. He was not a direct teacher of things. He was a brilliant creative of interest in you solving the problem without necessarily helping you to solve it. I now see, after the event, that was his trick. It wasn't a trick, it was just the way he worked. So he had a most tremendous impression on people through giving them ideas and letting them work things out for themselves.
Well, tell me more about Fisher, because he's had such an influence on your life as a person and as a researcher and a theoretician. Anything you like.
Well, in a way, there's so much to tell that I can only describe the level which he thinks at. He was thinking ahead of the pack all the time and thinking more deeply than anybody else. But he was also equipped mathematically to follow up these thoughts, so that the contribution that he made in both statistics and in, shall we call it, population genetics, the mathematical theory of population genetics, was not only highly original, but totally outstanding in retrospect. In statistics, he simply cleared the ground of the existing state of the subject, which had been ploughed endlessly by people like Karl Pearson, well, notably Karl Pearson, but also Edgeworth and others. And he just introduced totally new concepts from the depths of his clear thinking, which revolutionized the way we do statistics, introducing a whole new vocabulary at the same time, a new way of looking at things, new concepts of what we mean by information, which are specific to real information, informativeness, measures of informativeness, in a sense in which Shannon's more famous and later concept of information is simply a measure of the amount of information that a channel can carry, and makes no comment and isn't interested in whether the information means anything at all. It can either be a coded important message expressed as noughts and ones, or it can be a random series of noughts and ones. Shannon information thinks these two are the same. But Fisher information is a way of describing how informative a statistical analysis is. And it goes on, of course, to an understanding of how to design an experiment to make it as informative as possible. So the whole of the concept of design of experiments is a complete further development from Fisher's concepts of estimation and information and so forth. It's absolutely mind-boggling. He is, well, the best way I can describe his eminence and what should be his fame is what has been said by a well-known Danish statistician, Anders Hald, who has written the most astonishing books of the history of statistics in his retirement. I mean, if ever there was a retirement project, it's Anders Hald's 2 books on the history of statistics, history of mathematical statistics. And he simply classes Fisher with Laplace and with Gauss. That's the company that Fisher keeps, and that's just on the statistics side. And when you come on to the genetical side, the biological side, you have people like Richard Dawkins seeing him as Darwin's finest successor. So that's a measure of the man that we're dealing with.
One of the things that I think I remember he was interested in, and I'm quite vaguely interested in as a non-mathematician, was likelihood and probability. Am I right in thinking that he was one of those who developed the theories of probabilistic?
Well, I wonder if you know that my first book is called Likelihood.
No, I've forgotten.
I was so taken by Fisher's concept of likelihood, and here the influence of my brother John was quite strong too. But when you are trying to do statistics in human genetics, the paucity of data is the real problem. So you need to squeeze as much information as you can from the data that you've got, because you can't do the experiments which I've just been referring to. And so the question of efficiency, another of Fisher's words in statistics, the question of how do you get the maximum amount of information out of your data becomes absolutely critical. And this leads to a very strong interest in the principles of statistical inference. How are you supposed to operating a system so as to get these benefits from the data? And it's here that the concept of likelihood is absolutely vital. There's been a tendency, largely from wartime, to have statistical teaching dominated by the so-called Neyman-Pearson approach to statistics, which in itself is a development of Fisher's original thoughts about likelihood, incidentally. And for there to be less of an understanding of the fact that the likelihood function, as we call it, carries all the information in the data. This is rather more obvious to Bayesians, who have a different reason for being interested in likelihood. But I became fascinated in the human genetics context by the standalone concept of likelihood. So I wrote a book about it. And that book is 1972. It's been in print for 53 years now. And it was not a textbook. It was a cry of help an offer of help to the statistical profession to take Fisher's concept of likelihood seriously. Well, I don't think the book had that effect, but other effects brought likelihood to the fore in modern work. So it's a book of its time, but I'm rather proud of it. It was the first book I wrote.
When you said that the Bayesians were interested in this for other reasons, I was working with computer scientists who were developing Bayesian search systems, Keith van Rijsbergen and people. Did their work derive ultimately from Fisher and yourself at all?
Do they work?
Did their work derive in any way the Bayesians?
Well, there's a
people like Karen Needham.
Yeah, there's an absolute binding connection between the Bayesian position and likelihood, because Bayesians agree that the information that you get from your data is represented by the likelihood. Where my position and others of my thinking disagree is that we don't think you need a Bayesian background in order to interpret the likelihood. That is, we take the likelihood as it comes and look at that, and we think that the maximum likelihood, for example, the maximum likelihood value of the parameter is the thing of importance. To be a Bayesian, if you want to state the posterior probabilities of your hypotheses, which is their design, you've got to conjure up some prior probabilities to start with. Now, for geneticists, this is often quite straightforward, because your prior probabilities may indeed have been derived from the Mendelian assumption in the first place. But generally speaking, you don't have any prior probabilities to get this process started. So people call themselves Bayesians when actually they're just looking at likelihoods, and their whole computer-based methods may use the notion of a Bayesian prior distribution, but basically they are extracting information by using the likelihood. So there's not too much of a difference between us. There is a tremendous difference between us, 2 points of view. and the people who misinterpret typical tests of significance in a way which Fisher, who was after all one of their major creators, never intended. They treat probabilities derived from tests of significance as evidence themselves. Now that's not the way to do it.
Well, I'd love to go on with that, but I want to ask you something you mentioned earlier, which was that you've spent a lot of your retirement trying to refute the criticisms and calumnies directed at Fisher, particularly by Americans. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, I can tell you. It was all started by one shout of "Fisher is a eugenicist," which originated in a changed version of his Wikipedia entry, where somebody had advanced the word eugenicist as his primary function, as opposed to statistician or biologist or geneticist. And this was repeated very quickly in American circles by the inevitable internet, and in no time at all, without doing any homework as to who Fisher was, steps were taken to remove his name from top lectures in America and to issue statements by otherwise responsible organizations like the International Biometric Society that Fisher was a eugenicist and a racist, and enough was said by using those two words to have his reputation tarnished. This crossed the Atlantic very quickly, and it got into the hands of people at University College London who had their own reasons for wanting to demolish the reputations of Francis Galton and Karl Pearson. Pearson had been a vigorous eugenicist without actually being a member of the Eugenics Society, so he didn't get criticised too much in the first place because the bad boys were all supposed to be members of the Eugenics Society in this country. And this spread even to places like Rothamsted Experimental Station, who you would think would have stopped and wondered how their most prominent scientist was suffering this fate from people who'd clearly never looked into what Fisher's contribution to eugenics was, and who certainly was not a racist in any sense at all. And finally, the students of Gonville and Caius College found out about this, and they put up a petition on the basis of misinformation, and particularly these two words which were being bandied about. And the historian fellows of Caius got involved in this, I think encouraged the students. Certainly the senior tutor is a historian and was primarily and publicly within the college context involved in preparing a justification for removing a stained glass window in the Caius Hall, which had been put up in 1989 to mark Fisher's scientific contributions. And that was particularly disgraceful because there were amongst the senior fellows of Caius people who remembered R.A. Fisher and could talk about him. Nobody consulted them. I was there who had worked in the fields in which Fisher was famous for, and using the college as a base had created a career for myself in doing that. Nobody consulted me. It was a snap decision taken by the council on the behest of the senior tutor and the master, and on the basis of total ignorance about one of the most famous scientists of the 20th century. Well, I wasn't going to have that. He was a friend of mine. You don't let a friend down. So I started informing myself to a greater extent than I had been inclined to do before as to exactly what his association with the eugenics movement was. And in doing that, I found that, as usual, he was thinking more deeply and in a more forward way than any of his contemporaries, and that his contemporaries were, for the most part, understanding perfectly well what he was saying. And his proposal for some child allowances which would not be paid for by the state, as he is accused of having said, but no, that was not the way that it was done. He argued for those against Sir William Beveridge's proposals for flat rate child allowances. Beveridge was a member of the Eugenics Society too. They argued this out as both members of the Eugenics Society, and Beveridge won, at which point Fisher really gave up. He didn't continue. But looked at from today's perspective, it's extremely interesting, because what he was concerned about was the failure of the middle classes to reproduce their numbers at a time when the population, demographers could see, was likely to start reducing round about the time of the First World War, and as a consequence, of course, of the great loss of life during the First World War. And here today now we're in exactly the same position, but we don't yet seem to be prepared to ask ourselves the question that Fisher asked: which part of the population is not reproducing itself at the appropriate rate if things are to be stable? Well, it was an advanced thing to do. And what's more, he realized that there were, in the context of the inevitable fact that fertility itself is going to be partly a heritable quantity, there are going to be changes to the genetic composition of a population as a result of the differential fertility in the different classes. We're 100 years on now, and we still haven't started discussing this problem.
Are you winning? Are you winning this debate?
Well, I think that I and my friends are winning it in the sense of there is no risk to Fisher's reputation in the long term. None at all. I didn't resign my fellowship at Caius because I was encouraged to stand and fight. And that is what I have done, and I have argued and argued and argued. Nobody in the college has argued against me. I have been met by a wall of silence, which is not surprising, because that's the only way that my opposition can hide its ignorance. So I'm not at all concerned about Fisher's long-term reputation, but I'm extremely concerned about the reputation of Gonville and Caius College. And I suppose that that window will go back. Whether I live to see it going back is a different matter. These things take a long time. But there's no way that I want to see Gonville Keys College in the future being remembered as the college that took down a perfectly sensible memorial to a man as great as Ronald Aylmer Fisher.
Did Gonville also purge its walls of other alumni of the college who were associated with the, supposedly associated in some way with the slave trade? They decided to take down a whole lot of portraits. Is that the case or not?
No, we haven't taken down any other portraits as far as... I'm talking about Keys's
Yes,
experience.
Keys, yes.
No, we should certainly, if there's to be any permanent removal of the Fisher portrait, we should certainly take down Francis Crick, because he was saying most objectionable things about eugenics in the 1960s, which are well recorded and conveniently forgotten.
You have a window which has Venn, it has Fisher, has Crick, and I want to end the interview by saying that I hope one day it'll have Anthony Edwards in the window as well. So
Well, the only place for me to go is where Fisher is, and of course, curiously enough, I do possess one of the extensions to Venn diagrams that I've invented as a stained glass window by the same artist, Maria McLafferty, who did the 6 that were in the hall. And it can still be seen in my former Keys Rooms window. If you go into Tree Court, turn right at the Porter's Lodge and look straight ahead, it is still in the T1 staircase window.
So that needs to be moved into the hall.
And they would have to put it instead of Fisher. Nobody is going to have their arms or whatever put into Fisher's window except R.A. Fisher.
Good, well, I think on that hopeful note, thank you very much indeed, Anthony. That was lovely.